Hello, my name is Professor Amanda Reid, and I teach at Florida Coastal School of Law, and I'm here to talk about some of my research on roadside memorial crosses as they lay at the intersection between the Free Speech Clause and the Establishment Clause. I can start by giving an overview of the roadside memorial phenomenon. Understanding this phenomenon is an important first step in analyzing the free speech and Establishment Clause issues that are raised by the presence of these private memorials on public space. I will help sketch out the tension between the Free Speech Clause and the Establishment Clause. Roadside memorials are part of a growing trend among the bereaved who seek to make sense of, in essence, a senseless death that occurs along the public roadways. Senseless deaths along roadways surprise and shock us because modern technological advances have lulled us into thinking that we have some measure of control over death. These memorials, which often feature a Latin cross, are part of deeply meaningful bereavement practices that support the grieving process. These memorials are intensely personal, idiosyncratic expressions that are motivated by a seemingly senseless death. Roadside memorials are often created by friends and family members of teenagers who die in car crashes. Today, death has moved out of the cemetery. The nationwide diffusion of roadside memorials can be seen in every state, including Hawaii and Alaska, and while it is a relatively recent trend around the country, in some southwestern states, especially Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona, the practice dates back more than 200 years. Today, roadside memorials are no longer just an idiosyncratic rural southwestern practice. They can be seen across the globe. Roadside memorials are becoming an international phenomenon and are along the roadways in New Zealand, Australia, the Middle East, Europe, Japan, and the Americas. These roadside memorials are erected in both rural and suburban spaces. Memorials are erected on busy street corners, near big box stores and fast food restaurants, as well as in the medians of multi-lane highways and freeways, and on private property. In our modern society, death is professionally managed and largely invisible. With modern practices, modern advances, people are living longer, healthier lives, and death is less present in our everyday consciousness. Matters of death are handed over to the professionals, either law enforcement, emergency medical technicians, doctors, coroners, and funeral directors and ministers. In North America, nearly 3/4 of all deaths today occur in healthcare institutions. Death has moved out of the home and into professional institutions, with the majority of deaths now taking place in hospitals and nursing homes. Rather than caring for dying family members in the home, the current trend is to outsource that care to third-party professionals. Death is no longer an integrated part of life. It is insulated within institutions of death, and consequently, we are less accustomed to death, and an unexpected, sudden death often leaves the bereaved traumatized and shocked. Unexpected violent deaths of individuals participating in what we consider routines of life that we think are safe, such as daily commutes, are bad deaths. A good death, by contrast, is essentially any death that is due to old age, prolonged sickness, or a natural death that comes after a long sickness. A bad death is one that is sudden, violent, unpredicted, and therefore unnatural. In the United States, more than 30,000 people die in car crashes every year. In developed nations, traffic deaths are becoming a leading cause of fatality. Because we perceive driving to be safe, road fatalities are often received with great shock. Road fatalities are often shocking to friends and family, and the sudden death leaves the survivors unprepared for the loss. The unexpected death leaves them in a different type of shock. For some people, a complicated grief follows sudden, traumatic, and unexpected losses. Complicated grief deviates from the norm in both duration and symptom intensity. Complicated grief is characterized by a sense of disbelief, anger and bitterness, recurrent emotional pangs, yearning and longing, and preoccupation with thoughts of the deceased, which often include intrusive thoughts about the death. Researchers confirm that the sudden, traumatic, and unexpected death of a child is one of the most intense grief experiences for a parent. Thus, complicated grief and bereavement may be expected for road deaths of young, healthy individuals. While roadside memorials are individual and unique, they often share common qualities. In making roadside memorials, builders overwhelmingly choose a Latin cross as the focal point. Some roadside memorials are only a simple white cross, whereas others include elaborate displays of objects and mementos. The tokens incorporated into the elaborate displays can include flowers, candles, teddy bears, photographs, handwritten notes, as well as parts from the car wreckage. Some of the memorials have new objects added for special occasions, such as birthdays, holidays, and the anniversary of the death. Items placed at many of the roadside at the crosses reflect an ongoing dialogue with the deceased, and that's reflected in the notes left at the site, and the continuation of missed celebrations, which can be memorialized by graduation tassels. Another common feature of the roadside memorial is that they are created as close as possible to the last alive place, which is often on the public right-of-way. The last alive place has deeply meaningful significance for the bereaved. Often memorial makers take great efforts to identify precisely where they believe the last alive place to be. Clues, like stains and tire tracks on the ground where the vehicle stopped, are often used to identify this now sacred space. Memorial makers treat this space as sacred. The meaning and sacredness of the space come from the spilled blood at the accident site. Because of the meaningfulness of the place, memorials often reflect a blended sense of spirituality and the maker's own sense of what ritual is appropriate and necessary. Even when the memorials are unlawful, family and friends assert a self-proclaimed sense of authority to erect these memorials. The bereaved's authority is drawn from the intensity of grief, from the belief in the spiritual presence of the deceased, combined with a profound sense of the importance of place. The perceived higher moral knowledge of the mourners appears to empower them to grieve in the way they desire. Mourners are willing to take grief out of the confines of the cemetery and beyond the emotional and spiritual boundaries of the church to construct for themselves a new sacred place, fully recognizing that this process is open-ended and only those who grieve know when it is time to stop. Roadside memorials communicate in a way grave markers tucked away in a quiet cemetery cannot. There is a dual message to the memorial. On the one hand, the message is that this tragedy should not have happened. The memorial maker argues that they do not accept that this is a matter of course. They will not allow you to ignore it. And by building the shrine, they are making their personal story public. They refuse to forget, and they refuse to let you forget. On the other hand, the memorial says, don't let this happen to you or someone you love. And the this is not just the crash, but the grief and anguish that motivates and drives the construction of the memorial. Roadside memorials thus serve as a pilgrimage site for friends and family to remember and respect the deceased. It can also serve as a warning to other drivers. And this warning to others can help the bereaved find meaning in an otherwise meaningless death. Private memorials on public space, space which is now made sacred by the death of a loved one, may be an attempt to counter a meaningless and anonymous death. Road deaths are largely anonymous as modern forces work quickly and efficiently to remove evidence of an accident. The death of the injured are swiftly removed from the scene, and any road damage is repaired as soon as possible. Roadside memorials mark and identify what would otherwise be an invisible death spot. Therefore, roadside memorials may be a way to forestall an anonymous, depersonalized death on the modern roadway. For some bereaved, the ritual of creating a roadside memorial meets a deep human need that burial in a cemetery does not satisfy. Grieving rituals offer the bereaved comfort and solace and provide structure and order during times of crisis and disorder. Roadside memorials are often in addition to traditional interment rather than a substitute for one. And while the deceased are physically interred elsewhere, for some families, the roadside memorial is the main and immediate locus for remembering the loved one. The proliferation of roadside memorials is evidence that this form of remembrance meets an important human need. Modern culture tends to minimize and de-ritualize bereavement practices, such that these bereavement rituals have now deteriorated in meaning. This de-ritualization and deterioration has led to insufficient grieving and inadequate grief resolution. Current bereavement practices are often a one-time event, which fail to honor and support the grieving process that extends beyond the one-time funeral ritual. Modern practices allow time off from work only for certain family members and only for certain periods of time. These modern abbreviated rituals may be effective for some, especially when the death comes later in life or after an illness, because the bereaved have had time to pre-grieve. However, contemporary grieving rituals are inadequate for the death that is sudden, unanticipated, or violent, or is the death of a child. For these types of death, researchers have found that the grieving process is likely to be prolonged, with mourners reporting high distress, disorganization, and active grieving for many years following the loss. For many mourners of a bad death, the contemporary funeral rituals are insufficient because unexpected deaths often violate and shatter a mourner's expectation of the world. New rituals may be necessary to aid in the grieving process. Spontaneous memorials erected on the last alive place at the roadside are an example of an emerging ritual that helps satisfy this need in the grieving process. Physical objects or mementos left at the roadside memorial can come to symbolize the deceased, and the tokens can contain multiple meanings that represent the mourner's relationship with the deceased. Mourners can maintain a relationship with the deceased through these objects, and these tokens can be an extension of the self and often suggest that there's an ongoing interaction with the deceased. The proliferation of roadside memorials poses an important problem for public officials who are in an ongoing quandary concerning how to balance traffic safety and aesthetic interests of the community with the grieving process of the bereaved. Balancing the interests of road safety and maintenance, visual blight, and establishment cause concerns alongside the needs of the grieving can often become a public relations minefield. Roadside memorials have been a source of controversy and debate in both the United States and in other countries around the world. Public opinion is mixed about whether roadside memorials should be permitted or not. The public is generally deferential to roadside memorials that have been erected, even if the public does not fully share the memorial maker's sense of sacredness of the site. And while generally deferential to currently erected memorials, when polled about prospective memorials, the public's response is ambivalent. While roadside memorials can be deeply meaningful and healing for the mourners, some observers object to the sanctification of public roadways. Memorials on public spaces are situated in such a way to draw strangers in to share the grieving process. Some memorials are clearly visible and intended to be seen, while others are more personal and private. Participating in a stranger's roadside memorial can promote a sense of group solidarity, a symbolic coming together of the community in mourning. Yet sometimes strangers do not welcome being drawn into the grieving process because it brings unwanted reminders of death. For some, memorials are an unwelcome testament to the fragility and fleeting nature of life. These memorials are powerful reminders of the inherent dangers of driving, and viewers are reminded of these dangers while driving down the same roadways where somebody else died. In addition to viewing memorials as an unwanted reminder of tragic loss, some individuals see the memorials as eyesores. Teddy bears turn soggy and gray, flowers wilt, handwritten tributes become illegible. And more than just an issue of aesthetics, roadside memorials raise concerns about road maintenance and road safety. These memorials can interfere with road maintenance and mowing operations. The mementos and tokens left at roadside memorials can become hazardous projectiles when tall grass is mowed. Roadside memorials can also pose a safety hazard to other drivers. In Arizona, a Department of Transportation spokesperson reported that of the 4,000 rear-end collisions that occurred in a year, a troubling number involved drivers who stopped to view roadside memorials. In Wyoming, another Department of Transportation official considers roadside memorials dangerous and points to an accident where the death of a child was attributed to a driver who was distracted by a memorial for 2 young pedestrians killed earlier at that same site. And in Texas, a young woman was struck and killed by a car while she was visiting the roadside memorial for her cousin following the cousin's funeral. State and local governments across the country have adopted a patchwork of policies and regulations for roadside memorials. Policymakers struggle to balance the needs of the bereaved and the needs of the community. Many governments are considering appropriate limits on roadside displays as a way to balance these needs. Nearly half of the states have adopted some kind of policy regarding the placement of roadside memorials. Yet these policies vary widely, with some states expressly permitting and allowing private markers, some allowing only state-sponsored markers, and some having no express policy, whereas in other jurisdictions, these roadside memorials are expressly prohibited. Yet, this prohibition is not often enforced. In states where erecting roadside memorials are prohibited, public officials often turn a blind eye to memorials out of respect. Scholars have found a common theme of deference among transportation officials who try to balance safety concerns while simultaneously respecting a family's need to grieve the loved one. State officials are generally sensitive to the grief of the loved ones and show a great deal of deference to these memorials, notwithstanding any official policy. In states where roadside memorials are illegal, authorities often leave the memorials in place unless a complaint is filed. These local agencies take the unofficial stance of acknowledging the need for individuals to grieve and leave most memorials undisturbed. There is a tension between the free speech clause and the establishment clause here. And at base, there's a difference between private speech endorsing religion, which the free speech clause and the free exercise clause protect, and government speech endorsing religion, which the establishment clause forbids. Roadside memorials not only serve as a powerful signifier of death and space, but also serve an important expressive function for the loved ones of the deceased. The memorial speaks as much for the memorial maker as it does the loved one who is memorialized by, reflecting the maker's image of the loved one. But the expressive right to memorialize a loved one is not unbounded. The Supreme Court has noted that the First Amendment does not guarantee the right to communicate one's views at all times and places or in any manner that may be desired. For states that prohibit all roadside memorials, the question arises whether such a prohibition abridges the free speech interests of the memorial maker. Content-neutral restrictions on speech in public fora are considered reasonable time, place, and manner regulations if they are narrowly tailored to serve a significant government function and leave open adequate alternative channels of communication. The courts have confirmed that states may regulate signage and commercial advertising based on aesthetic and traffic safety concerns. These significant governmental interests extend to both commercial and non-commercial speech. In one instance, in upholding a city's ban on all signs on public property, the Supreme Court ruled that the ordinance was constitutionally permissible time, place, and manner restrictions for 3 reasons. First, the government has a weighty, essentially aesthetic interest in reducing visual clutter. Second, the content-neutral regulation applies regardless of the subject matter of the sign. And third, there were ample alternative channels of communication because the ban did not extend to private property and nothing indicated that these signs were in any way uniquely valuable or an important mode of communication. So courts have found alternative channels of communication inadequate when the regulation forecloses an entire medium of public expression across the landscape of a particular community. The Supreme Court has been troubled by laws that completely foreclose an entire medium of expression. The court struck down an ordinance that completely banned the distribution of pamphlets in a community, or handbills on public streets, or door-to-door distribution of literature, or all live entertainment. While prohibitions that completely foreclose an entire medium may be content neutral, the court emphasized that the danger they pose to the freedom of speech is apparent because by eliminating a common means of speaking, such measures can suppress too much speech. A number of states prohibit roadside memorials. These content-neutral regulations serve the significant government interest of protecting traffic safety and community aesthetics. Yet the unresolved question is whether a complete ban on all roadside memorials leaves ample and adequate alternatives for the mourner's communication. Memorial makers could argue that the place of the memorial is so inextricably intertwined with the message of the memorial that moving the memorial to another place would not be an ample and adequate alternative. A cemetery or other memorial site is not an adequate substitute for a roadside memorial. The last alive place is deeply important. The site is of supreme importance because it is sanctified by the spilled blood of the loved one. Scholars emphasize that the issue of placement and place is absolutely critical to the bereaved, who ascribe to the location a special, even sacred significance. Placement of the memorial on the last alive place has the effect of transforming the public land into private, sacred space. Moving the memorial elsewhere would be ineffective and would vitiate the importance of placing the memorial on the last alive place. The message of remembrance and caution are inextricably intertwined with the last alive place. Thus, the location of the speech is part of the expressive message. Changing the location undermines the message. Roadside memorials leave visible and poignant reminders of death on public space. As Justice John Paul Stevens has acknowledged, that sometimes the location of the sign is a significant component of the message it conveys. By removing roadside memorials from the site of the death, the message of the memorial is altered. By eliminating the roadside memorial, would-be memorial makers argue that they do not have an adequate alternative channel to communicate their message. In considering the Establishment Clause, the Establishment Clause is often used as the basis to challenge the display of religious symbols on public property. For some in the community, the endorsement of religion through displays of religious symbols on public lands undermines respect for the diversity of faith traditions and moral philosophies, whereas others view the invalidation of public displays of religious symbols as evidence of hostility towards religion. This is a hotly contested area of the law, and the Supreme Court's jurisprudence on the constitutionality of religious symbols on public property continues to evolve. Sometimes the display of a creche on public property violates the Establishment Clause, but sometimes it does not. In Lynch v. Donnelly, the Supreme Court held that a creche located in a display near the heart of the city's shopping district that included a variety of Christmas symbols, such as a Santa Claus, a reindeer, a Christmas tree, and carolers, and a teddy bear, and a season's greeting banner, was not a violation of the Establishment Clause. Writing for the court, Chief Justice Berger applied the three-part Lemon test and concluded that the nativity scene was permissible in the context of the city's overall Christmas display. First, the creche had a secular purpose in celebrating and depicting the origins of the Christmas holiday and acknowledging our shared national heritage. Second, any advancement of or benefit to religion resulting from the scene was indirect, remote, and incidental, and no more an advancement of religion than other types of conduct found permissible in prior cases, such as legislative prayer, release time for public school students to attend religious education, tax exemption for church properties, and Sunday closing laws. And third, there was no excessive entanglement between religion and government because there was no evidence of an ongoing day-to-day interaction between church and state over the display, and the public expense involved was minimal. The court applied the Lemon analysis in this case, yet it emphasized it was unwilling to be confined to any single test or criterion in this sensitive area. 5 years later, in the ACLU case, the Supreme Court held that the display of a creche on the courthouse grand staircase violated the Establishment Clause. The courthouse in this case was the seat of the county government, and the grand staircase was, according to the court, the main, the most beautiful, and the most public part of the courthouse. But in the same case, the court held that an 18-foot Hanukkah menorah placed next to a 45-foot Christmas tree outside another local government building did not violate the Establishment Clause. The court's ruling turned on the particular physical setting of each display. The creche was not exhibited with any other secular items that would detract from the display's religious message, and it bore a religious banner praising glory to God in the highest. By prominently displaying this religious scene in the seat of local government, the Supreme Court observed that no viewer could reasonably think that it occupies this location without the support and approval of the government. On the other hand, The menorah was part of a combined display with a Christmas tree and a sign saluting liberty. This combined display celebrated secular aspects of both Judaism and Christianity. The court recognized that the city could celebrate Christmas and Hanukkah as cultural traditions independent of their religious significance. Rather than endorsing religion, the court found the display of the menorah, the Christmas tree, and the sign saluting liberty had the effect of acknowledging that both Christmas and Hanukkah are part of the same winter holiday season, which has attained a secular status in our society. To further consider some of the Establishment Clause jurisprudence, the Supreme Court has held that sometimes a city may display the Ten Commandments on public property, but sometimes it may not. On the same day, the Supreme Court issued two differing opinions on the constitutionality of displaying the Ten Commandments on public property. Justice Stephen Breyer provided this key swing vote in the two cases. In Van Orden v. Perry, a 6-foot-tall monument inscribed with the Ten Commandments was placed along 17 monuments and 21 historical markers on 22 acres surrounding the state capitol in Texas. The monument was donated and erected in 1961 by a private civic and patriotic organization. In analyzing the Establishment Clause issue, a plurality of the court stated that the Lemon Test was not useful in dealing with this sort of passive monument that the state of Texas had erected on its capitol grounds. Instead, the court's analysis was driven by both the nature of the monument and by our nation's history. The plurality also recognized the religious significance of the Ten Commandments as well as its undeniable historical meaning. And the court concluded simply having religious content or promoting a message consistent with a religious doctrine does not run afoul of the Establishment Clause. The plurality held that the inclusion of the Ten Commandments monument for nearly 40 years among other political and legal monuments on the Capitol grounds was not a violation of the Establishment Clause. Justice Breyer provided the fifth vote and wrote separately to concur in the judgment that the monument was not a violation of the Establishment Clause. Justice Breyer noted that the Establishment Clause does not compel the government to purge from the public sphere all that in any way partakes of the religious. He acknowledged Van Orden was a borderline case, and in evaluating difficult borderline cases, Justice Breyer saw no test-related substitute for the exercise of legal judgment. He emphasized the need to remain faithful to the underlying purpose of the Establishment Clause and to take account of context and consequences measured in light of those purposes. In this fact-intensive examination, Justice Breyer found the context and physical setting of the display suggested the state intended the non-religious aspects of the tablet's message to predominate. The display was donated by a secular civic organization, and the monument itself prominently acknowledged its donor, which further distanced the state from the religious aspects of the Ten Commandments message. And the physical setting of the monument suggested little or nothing of the sacred and did not lend itself to religious activity. Finally, Justice Breyer emphasized that 40 years had passed, during which time the monument had not been challenged. This length of time suggested to him that few individuals, whatever their system of belief, are likely to have understood the monument as amounting to a government effort to favor a particular religion over another one. Yet the same day as the Van Orden opinion came down, McCreary County versus ACLU of Kentucky was also issued. Justice Breyer voted with a 5-4 majority to hold that the display of the Ten Commandments in 2 Kentucky courthouses did violate the Establishment Clause. 2 Kentucky counties prominently displayed large gold-framed copies of an abridged text of the King James Version of the Ten Commandments in courthouse hallways. After lawsuits were filed, the Ten Commandments were supplemented with other secular and historical documents, such as the Star-Spangled Banner's lyrics and the Declaration of Independence. According to the Kentucky counties, the purpose of displaying the Ten Commandments, along with the other documents, was to emphasize the significant role these texts played in the foundation of the American system of law and government. Yet foundational documents like the 14th Amendment or the original Constitution were not included in the display. Writing for the majority, Justice David Souter noted that under the Establishment Clause, detail is key. And after examining the iterations of the display, the court found that the display failed the secular purpose prong of the Lemon Test because the dominant religious nature of the Ten Commandments was unmistakable. In evaluating religious displays on public property, the Supreme Court has sometimes held that the displays are government speech, which is immune from free speech challenges, but sometimes it is private speech on public property. In 2009, a religious sect brought a free speech challenge to a government's refusal to display its religious monument on public property. Interestingly, the religious organization did not pursue an Establishment Clause challenge to the government's display of another religious monument on public property. In a public park in Utah, 11 privately donated monuments, including a Ten Commandments monument, were on permanent display. Sumim, a religious organization founded in 1975, sought to erect a stone monument in that park that would contain the 7 aphorisms of Sumim. When the city refused, Sumim brought suit arguing the city violated the free speech clause by accepting a Ten Commandments monument while denying the 7 aphorisms monument. In rejecting Sumim's free speech challenge, the Supreme Court explained that the free speech clause has no application where the state is engaging in its own speech. The free speech clause restricts government regulation of private speech. It does not regulate government speech. The court explained that unlike speeches and other transitory expressive acts, placing permanent monuments in a public park is best viewed as a form of government speech and is therefore not subject to scrutiny under the Free Speech Clause. While the line between private speech and government speech at times may be difficult to discern, in this instance the court had no trouble determining that it was government speech. Permanent monuments displayed on public property, according to the court, typically represent government speech. Government can speak through its own government-financed monuments, but it can also speak through privately financed monuments that a government elects to accept and display. Governments exercise selection and control over the permanent monuments that are displayed on public lands. Thus, the message from these displays is government speech. The court explained that because installing permanent monuments in a public park is not analogous to delivering speeches or holding marches and demonstrations, the traditional public forum analysis does not apply to permanent monuments. Public parks are capable of accommodating a large number of speakers without defeating the essential functions of the land. But these parks can accommodate only a limited number of permanent monuments. Speakers, no matter how long-winded, eventually come to the end of their remarks. Persons distributing leaflets and carrying signs at some point tire and go home. Monuments, however, endure. They monopolize the use of the land on which they stand, and they interfere permanently with other uses of public space. The court also distinguished temporary seasonal displays from the permanent monuments. Although some public parks can accommodate and may be made generally available for temporary private displays, the same is rarely true for permanent monuments. Now, while the form analysis generally does not apply to permanent monuments on public property, the court interestingly did illustrate an instance when the public forum doctrine could apply. The court said, for example, if a town created a monument on which all of its residents, or all those meeting some other criterion, could place the name of a person to be honored or some other private message, the forum doctrine might properly be applied to the permanent monument. Now, the term following the Summum case, the court was again faced with the issue of displaying a religious symbol privately donated, which is standing on public property. In Salazar v. Buono, in 1934, members of the Veterans of Foreign Wars placed a Latin cross in the Mojave Desert to honor American soldiers who died in World War I. The cross was located on federal lands in the Mojave National Preserve on a granite outcropping known as Sunrise Rock. The cross was made 4-inch diameter white metal pipes and was less than 8 feet tall. It had been replaced and repaired a number of times. While the Mojave case was pending in the lower courts, Congress, in a series of legislative enactments between 2001 and 2004, twice prohibited the use of federal funds to remove the cross. Congress designated the cross as a national memorial and then transferred the 1 acre of land on which the Mojave cross sat to the private entity of the Veterans of Foreign Wars, with the stipulation that if the cross ceased to be a war memorial, the land would revert to the federal government. Petitioners challenged Congress's land transfer as a violation of the district court's original permanent injunction. The Ninth Circuit agreed, and the land transfer was a violation of the permanent injunction. The Supreme Court, however, ruled 5-4 that the land transfer was not a violation of the original injunction. The narrow grounds of the Salazar decision don't resolve all of the questions we still have when we see memorial crosses on public lands. On the heels of the Salazar opinion, the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals ruled that 12-foot cross memorial crosses erected on public property for fallen highway patrol troopers was a violation of the Establishment Clause. The private organization that erected the memorial crosses explained that the cross was selected to memorialize the officer because, quote, only a white cross could effectively convey the simultaneous message of death, honor, remembrance, gratitude, sacrifice, and safety. The 10th Circuit, relying on the Supreme Court's Summum opinion, was persuaded that these memorials were privately financed and donated monuments that the government accepted and displayed, and determined that these memorials were not private speech on public land, but rather were government speech, the scope and content of which is restrained by the Establishment Clause. Thus, in evaluating the Establishment Clause challenge to 12-foot 12-foot crosses dedicated to state troopers, the 10th Circuit applied the Lemon test and could, according to the court, discern a plausible secular purpose in erecting the memorial crosses, yet the court found that the memorials had the impermissible effect of conveying to a reasonable observer that the state was endorsing Christianity. The court distinguished Christmas displays from the memorial crosses because Christmas, according to the court, has been widely embraced as a secular holiday. Yet, according to the court, there is no evidence that the cross has been widely embraced by non-Christians as a secular symbol of death. The court also distinguished a permissible 10 Commandments display when part of a historical presentation from the memorial crosses here because the crosses stand alone, adorned with the state troopers' information. Additionally, the court noted that the 12-foot crosses were 10 times larger than typical roadside memorials, which were often between 12 and 16 inches tall. The size and location of the crosses bolstered the court's conclusion that a reasonable observer would believe that the state was endorsing Christianity through the use of the Latin cross, which, according to the court, is unequivocally a symbol of the Christian faith. Memorial makers are avoiding readily available alternative avenues for ventilating their expression. By avoiding and supplementing the cemetery memorial, these bereaved are communicating that the cemetery is an inadequate avenue for their expression. The growing popularity of this mode of expression, which raises traffic safety, aesthetic, and religious neutrality concerns, forces policymakers to decide whether to regulate this expression. If policymakers either ignore or expressly permit roadside crosses, it remains unresolved whether the state opens themselves up to Establishment Clause challenge by tacitly or expressly permitting crosses to remain on public lands. Governments must be careful not to appear to endorse religion by adopting the message of the memorial cross on public lands. Remember, as Justice Souter observed, whenever a government maintains a monument that has some religious character, the specter of violating the Establishment Clause will behoove the government to take care to avoid the appearance of an establishment of religion, in the sense of the government's adoption of the tenets expressed or symbolized. To assess Establishment Clause concerns created by roadside crosses on public property, it's important to determine both the speaker and the message. In light of the postmodern sensibilities shown by the Supreme Court in the Sumim case, it's unclear who the speaker is or what the message is when a roadside cross is erected on public property. The court in Sumim recognized that frequently it's not possible to identify a single message that is conveyed by an object or by a structure. And consequently, the thoughts and sentiments expressed by a government entity that accepts and honors such an object may be quite different from those of either its creator or its donor. Thus, the message of the original creator of the display may differ from the message of the entity that expressly or tacitly accepts the display. In evaluating whether speech is private or governmental, the Supreme Court is focused on the degree of editorial control over the message. The degree of editorial control and ultimate responsibility for the speech will depend on the contours of the particular policy adopted by a government. When a government erects and maintains a uniform state-approved roadside memorial, a court is most likely to conclude that the memorial is government speech. An official state-sponsored marker that has a single uniform message, like Florida's Drive Safely message, is government speech rather than pure private speech. But Policymakers may desire to avoid Establishment Clause concerns and can, in some instances, create limited public forums. Now, in addition to uncertainty about the speaker, there is also uncertainty about the message communicated by roadside memorials on public property. The Supreme Court's Establishment Clause jurisprudence contemplates that a display can have multiple meanings and multiple messages. This suggests a multiplicity of meanings and messages can exist within a single display. Roadside memorials can simultaneously communicate more than one message on behalf of more than one speaker. Identifying a single predominant message can sometimes be difficult, and such messages can change over time. For example, a single festooned memorial along a roadway sends a very different message from a mass of memorials dotting along a stretch of highway. The aggregation of individual memorials sends a message about the hazardousness of the highway in a way that a single memorial cannot. In responding to the complex roadside memorial phenomenon, policymakers vary greatly, both in their general attitude towards roadside memorials as well as in the displays and aspects of the various policies. I thank you for listening. I have sought to educate you on the roadside memorial phenomenon as well as highlighting the tension between the Free Speech Clause and the Establishment Clause. I look forward to talking to you again.